Hello, everybody, and welcome to this social media live from the World Health Organization. My name is Nika Alexander, and we're here today to talk about drugs to treat COVID. So therapeutics, basically, that's how we call them. I'm joined by two people. The first person to pop on your screen was Dr. Mariangela Simao. She's our Assistant Director General for Access to Medicines and Health Products, and also Dr. Janet Diaz. She's our lead for clinical management in the WHO Health Emergencies Program. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Nika.
Thank you.
So there's been some news recently about new potential treatments, because they're not fully cleared or validated treatments yet, but a couple of recent announcements. So we want to talk about those. We want to talk about the big picture a little bit of what treatments exist for COVID, and then what the process is from the moment that a company releases a press release about a promising drug until WHO gives it the thumbs up and says, yes, people around the world can use that drug. So we want to go through all of those. But this is a social media live, and we're meant to talk to you in the public. So if you have questions for us on Twitter, use #AskWHO. This is the same one we use all the time. If you're on LinkedIn or Facebook, just drop your question in the comments, and our colleagues will be scanning for questions and sending them along over to us. You can also watch via YouTube, but you can't ask questions that way. So if you want to ask questions, hop on those other platforms. So let's start with you, Dr. Diaz. Can you tell us, as I mentioned off the top, there have been two recent medicines that got a lot of media coverage. They were announced via press releases from the companies that developed them. Can you just walk us through those two medications, just what we heard about them right off the top, and then we'll get into a little bit more detail.
Thanks, Nika. So great question. So it was good news to hear about the two new drugs. These are two oral antivirals called Molnupiravir and Paxlovid. And these press releases really was a good news because they were robust clinical trials, and they showed positive results from an interim analysis. So what we know is that they were tested in patients with risk factors for severe disease, and they were tested in patients who were early in the disease, meaning they were less than 5 days of symptoms. And their interim analysis reports a reduction in risk of hospitalization. Both these drugs the same thing though? So both of these were announced via press releases from their companies, so Merck and Pfizer. And as you said, one is Molnupiravir and one is Paxlovid. Did they both seem to have that kind of the same potential reduction in risk? We're still evaluating the evidence, so I cannot make a comparison between the two drugs. I will just say that's what was released in the press releases. They're different mechanisms of action. They're both antivirals though, so that means they're stopping the replication of the virus, which is by mechanism, so novel mechanism, so that's good. And they both seem to be reporting benefit in the reduction of hospitalization. But again, I can't compare because we haven't seen all the data, and we need to look and really deeply evaluate the evidence, the trial information in order for us to make a recommendation.
So we'll come to Dr. Simao in a second, but just one more question for you, Dr. Diaz. So how does WHO make that evaluation? There are some studies ongoing. We work with those companies and many pharmaceutical companies, but how do we go from hearing about something in a press release to having an opinion or a recommendation about something?
So it's a great question. It's actually kind of a complex, long process. But we try to do it quickly. We try to do it transparently so that our guidelines are trustworthy. So first, we need to get the results of the study. So we cannot work off a press release. That's not sufficient information. We need the study details and the actual numbers of patients treated, the number of events, the number of hospitalizations, etc. So we need the results. So because we have had good communications with the drug developers, which is good, they have agreed to share that data with us under confidentiality. So even though they have not yet published the full results in the public space or in a journal, we have had access to that. So that allows us to speed up the process, meaning we take the data, now we analyze it, we synthesize it, we do something that's technically called a meta-analysis, and we look at the data to see what is the effect, what is the real estimate of effect, and are we certain in this effect? And so that's the work that's ongoing right now with our independent methodology team, with a systematic review team. And we've also already met with our guideline development group panel. That's our external panel of experts that's going to look at the evidence. And we started already preparation discussions about these two drugs, in order to be able to be very well ready and prepared for when the analysis is complete, that we can draft recommendations.
Dr. Simao, your full-time job is on increasing access to medicines, essentially. So first, speaking about these, before we speak more broadly about that, but speaking about the two companies that developed these medicines, they've already also issued press releases saying that they're working on making them more accessible for people if and when they have been evaluated and deemed useful. So what has WHO done with those two companies at the moment? And then we can speak more broadly.
Yeah, first let me compliment Janet's information, because once we evaluate, and it's part of WHO's guidance, WHO still has another process that we put in place, which is, we called it the prequalification process. Because first you see that the drug works, right? That it's safe and it's efficacious. And then we issued already, for example, an expression of interest for the manufacturers for molnupiravir, which is one of the drugs that WHO is assessing, for the manufacturers to be pre-qualified by WHO. Why is this important? Because then the international procurement agencies like UNICEF or the Global Fund, they can use the WHO's assessment and can help countries to register with the national regulatory authority. So this is a complementary work that WHO does once the guideline, once we see that it's a promising molecule, a promising drug that's coming up. So this deals with the issue of the licensing, and the production. Because these are not the first two drugs that are being assessed by WHO. WHO has already assessed other drugs, but they are called monoclonal antibodies and also dexamethasone. But these drugs are biologicals and they're very difficult to produce. These two that we are assessing right now, actually they are pharmaceutical products. So they are easier to be manufactured in different places. So one of the companies, MSD, which is the Merck Sharp Dome US that has molnupiravir, they already licensed it for Indian producers, and they also license, when I say license, it's the intellectual property licensing, so that other manufacturers can produce it. So they have licensed it to the medicines patent pool, and the other producer, which Pfizer, has announced that they will do a deal with the medicines patent pool, and that they're still finalizing the final agreements. But why is this important? Because many times when these drugs come into the market, either they are new drugs or they're being repurposed. They are being used for other indications in the case of COVID. Many times when they come, they are not available, or they are not in quantities that are needed, or they are not affordable. Now, so to have this licensing agreements, and WHO does have also the COVID technology access pool, which is to share knowledge, to share intellectual property through the medicines patent pool, and to share to do technology transfer. So this is a combination of issues that ensure that the drugs will be available in the quantities we need, increase manufacture, and also they are also designed to decrease the price of the drugs, because everybody knows, that when you have more products in the market, you have the prices are reduced. So these are welcome news that these products are being licensed. We just expect that the licensing can increase affordability, including for upper middle income countries.
Dr. Simao, a follow-up question for you on this, actually. So you spoke about how WHO's pre-qualification process makes it easier for international organizations like UNICEF to acquire these products and make them available in some countries. But on Facebook, Angelina Rose is asking, don't the National Institutes of Health have to approve them? So are there processes in some countries, are there other processes that new drugs have to go through?
Of course, the products have to be registered at country level. They're usually the national regulatory authorities, right? They have different names in different countries. What's the advantage of having a product that's pre-qualified with WHO, or some of the vaccines they are authorized for emergency use, is that the countries can rely on WHO's assessment, because not every country can do inspections, not every country has access to the full dossier. So countries, for example, for vaccines, where there were WHO facilitated 622 registrations of the AstraZeneca different vaccines at country level. No, so it's a dual purpose. One is to ensure that global procurement can happen for quality assured products, and the other hand is that to facilitate the entry at country level, the authorization at country level.
Just to remind everyone, if you have a question for us, if you're on Twitter, use hashtag AskWHO. If you are on LinkedIn or Facebook, drop your question in the comment, as Angelina Rose did just now as well. We have a question that I think will help us open to a larger topic. So Zara says, availability and cost are huge factors in the healthcare industry. And I like how she bridges out from just talking about these medicines to the healthcare industry. Basically, Dr. Diaz, medicines don't administer themselves. Even if a patient tests themselves and finds out they're positive for COVID, generally they cannot treat themselves. And the clinical care, what we're talking about, caring for a patient with COVID, is so much more than administering a drug. So can you talk a little bit about the whole universe of help that countries need in order to properly care for somebody who's sick with COVID?
Gosh, thanks, Anika. It's a great question. It is, we write these guidelines, and we have a clinical guideline on a comprehensive management approach for COVID-19 patients. And then we have this therapeutics targeted guideline just on the drugs to treat COVID-19. But what we must do is actually support member states and support countries adapt and implement these guidelines in practice. And that means making COVID care pathways in your facility, in your region, at the national level. And that COVID care pathway starts with recognizing and diagnosing that you have testing, that you have to see if you have COVID, right? If you have symptoms, that if you're concerned you may have COVID. So the early testing is quite important to get you on the COVID care pathway. That pathway also needs to have good clinicians who know how to assess if you have any signs of severe disease. So like if you have respiratory distress, chest pain, trouble breathing, those are warning signs, and those triage signs need to be detected so that you can get on the right COVID care pathway. So if you're someone who has severe disease or critical disease, then the care pathway includes treatments such as oxygen. That's the number one life-saving treatment that we first started with at the beginning of the pandemic. Since then, now we have more drugs in that severe critical patient that saves lives, including corticosteroids, including IL-6 receptor blockers, and in some patients, monoclonal antibodies called casirivimab and imdevimab, for certain patients that are severe and critical. So now we have this package of care, including other things that gets done in a hospital to ensure that you have safe care, prevent any hospital complications, and that you ensuring early rehab, those sorts of things. So a nice care package to make sure that you have the best outcome. For those patients that are not severe and critical, then you go on another care pathway. That's for the mild, moderate patients, and those patients can be treated as an outpatient. At home, being monitored, making sure they monitor themselves for any warning signs. We also had recommended the use of the pulse oximeter at home to check yourself in certain patients to make sure that if you got worse, that it was detected early and then you can go to a hospital. And now we have on our treatment package, so for those that are mild, moderate, monoclonal antibodies, again, the same one, casirivimab and imdevimab, that has been shown to reduce hospitalization, and we have a recommendation for that. But now we have to look at the other drugs. There's also other monoclonal antibodies that are showing promise that we will look at with our guideline development group. And then, of course, these two novel antivirals that we're discussing today that we're going to look at to see what their role will be in the COVID care pathway.
So you keep using the word novel just to help everyone understand. That just means new, right? New novel or new antiviral or a drug
Yeah.
that was against the virus.
That was new, because the other ones, remember, we had the repurposed ones. Those were the old drugs that we just used for COVID, and these actually were developed for SARS-CoV-2.
So, for example, you mentioned this briefly as well. There's corticosteroids that are very useful in helping some patients, and those were previously used for other purposes. And through research, we were able to see that those are useful for some COVID patients. But these two drugs we're speaking about most today, molnupiravir and Paxlovid. That's answering a question on Facebook from Ken Moriuki. He wanted to be reminded what the name of those two drugs were. These ones were developed specifically to treat COVID. That's the good news. Can you tell us a little bit, though, Dr. Diaz? There's a lot of excitement. People think, well, then, I can just take this pill and I'll be safe from COVID. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, how and when to use these. But can you just repeat who are the groups that these drugs seemed useful in the initial research that was done?
Thanks, Nika. So just to be clear, and this should be very clear, that the preliminary results that we have, the information is that these antivirals were tested in high-risk patients, meaning patients who had a risk factor for severe disease, and early in disease, meaning they had symptoms for less than 5 days. And they were mild and moderate, meaning that they were not in hospital, they were not on oxygen. There were other studies for one of these drugs that actually were stopped because there was no effect in those patients per what's been released in the press, in those patients who were hospitalized on oxygen. So really it's looking like the role for these will be in the outpatient mild patients, but early disease and high risk patients where the benefit was reduction in hospitalization.
Dr. Simao, just coming back again to the work that you do, how does WHO make the drugs that the ones that WHO now recommends, that we have been able to look at the research, we've seen a good effect on patients, how does WHO go about making them more available, but also more affordable? Because sometimes it's a problem for the patient, sometimes it's a problem for the healthcare system that can't afford these expensive drugs. So how can WHO make sure that the drugs are more available, so manufactured in more places, but specifically cheaper?
Yeah, this is a super important question, Nika, because I'm going to talk beyond COVID, right? Because this has been a huge concern, because some of these therapies that are coming for cancer, for genetic disease, the gene therapies, the biotherapeutics in general, they come to the market at a very high cost. And we've seen a change with the member states. WHO works with countries, we call countries member states, right? And we've seen a change in recent years of a lot of concern with the high-priced medicines that are coming into the market. WHO does hold a forum with industry, with civil society organizations, and with governments every 2 years, what we call a fair pricing forum. Right? And it's highly in demand, and it's focusing mostly on these new therapies, the cancer and the treatment for rare diseases. Some of these therapies, the gene therapies, are costing like $3 million per year per patient. Right? So there is a lot of discussion, and the member states have approved, the countries have approved a resolution talking about the need for transparency in pricing. Because many times countries have clauses when they sign contracts with companies, they are not allowed to disclose the price. And we are not only pushing for the disclosure of prices, but also for the linkage between the cost of what we know, what's the cost of research and development of a drug, and the cost the price that it goes in the market. So there's a lot of work on this beyond COVID. On COVID, we are in discussions, and Janet and I, we are in discussions with each of these companies with other parts, with UNITAID and UNICEF, the Global Fund, on the pricing that they are going to be charging, on the availability to whom we can ensure that there will be access to products so that all these products don't only go to high-income countries, right? That we ensure that in low, middle-income countries, upper-middle countries, patients also have access to these drugs and that they are affordable. So we are usually in touch with each company as the drugs come into the market and discuss access plans, how much it's going to cost, and what are the conditions for international procurement for this drug and for access for the different countries.
Thank you, Dr. Simao. So for anyone who wants to ask a question on Twitter, use hashtag AskWHO and then drop in your question. If you are on LinkedIn or Facebook, you can put your question in the comments, and you can watch on YouTube, but you can't ask questions on YouTube. So we have a question on Facebook from G. Jason Sakor, who's from Liberia, and wants to know sort of a two-part question, but I'll use the second part. Is there medicine to treat people who have already contracted COVID-19? So we talked about that a little bit already, and we were talking today about two new medicines that are designed specifically to treat people who have COVID-19. But Dr. Diaz, I wanted to come to you on this one. I think we were all very excited when these new medicines were announced recently, the Molnupiravir and Paxlovid. And it sounded like you pop a pill and you're fine. So you test, you find out you're positive for COVID, you pop a pill and you're fine, which sounds really easy. But there's actually a bit more involved than that. Can you tell us, based on the initial research, how these medicines were meant to be administered?
Oh, it's a good question. I can give you a little bit more detail about the Molnupiravir one, which we've had the data for a longer period of time. It is, again, the use case or the patients that were studied were those that were high risk. So again, so it wasn't everyone was studied. Not every person who had COVID was studied in these trials. It was a select group of patients, those high risk patients who have a risk factor for severe disease. It was also those who were early in their disease, meaning their symptoms were less than 5 days. And you ask, why is that? And it makes sense, because at the beginning of the COVID-19, the viral load, the number of virus load in the body is very high. So you would think that the antivirals would be much more active at that time. And again, that's where we saw it. We're not seeing it in the later phase of the disease when someone may be more severe or someone's hospitalized, when there's something, the body is now responding in a different way and doesn't need an antiviral, actually needs something that like the corticosteroids, like an immunomodulator. So, but going back to your question, the Molnupiravir is it's an oral drug, but it's not just one-time drug and that's it. It's a drug that needs to be taken for 5 days, twice a day. And I think it's actually, I can't tell you exactly the number of pills twice a day, but it's not just one pill a day. So we must not oversimplify this treatment approach. And again, so you have to choose the right patient, choose the right dose, give the patient the right course of treatment for the anticipated benefit. Like what I said before was a reduction in hospitalization, which is what they saw in the preliminary results.
Can you just summarize that for us again, Dr. Diaz? I've heard you say it before, and I love it's so succinct the way you put it about the right treatment for the right patient at the right time. Can you just say that one again for us? Because I hope I got it in the right order.
So I think I just want to emphasize again, there's not one pill for all patients with COVID-19. It's not one size fits all. It's because the disease is different, and we know that, right? We know some people get severe and critical disease, and those patients require the right treatment for those patients is immunomodulation right now, which includes corticosteroids, IL-6 receptor blockers, and in some of those patients, monoclonal antibodies. So that's the right patient, and you want to give those treatments actually as soon as you can. As soon as someone shows severity signs, that they need more that they have to go on oxygen, then they go into this care pathway. So it's the right time. You don't want to delay these treatments. On the other hand, if you're someone who's mild patient, again, you want to get to, and you're high risk. Let's say you are a high risk person that you have a risk factor for severe disease, and you develop a concern that you have COVID, then you're going to get tested quickly. Get the right test at the right time, and then for those patients, the right treatment. So those patients do not get corticosteroids, do not get IL-6 receptor blockers, because that would not give any benefit in the early phase. Then what we do know now, which we have a recommendation, is the monoclonal antibodies, casirivimab and imdevimab, do have impact in reducing hospitalization that we have a recommendation for. And we are looking at these 2 new antivirals, the oral ones, to see if they also, if once we look at the data, do they show similar, reduction in hospitalization that we feel certain, then we would write a recommendation for that. Is that clear?
It's a lot of information. How do you summarize it? You usually say the right medicine for the right patient at the right time?
Yeah, so that's just got to bring the right medicine for the right patient at the right time. So
all right.
I hope that's clear.
I have 2 questions now for you, Dr. Simao. I think I'll put them together. They're both from Facebook. One is from Jayakumar Padmanabha Pillai, who says, what are the actions WHO has taken for distribution of medicines and medical materials to low and lower income countries? And similarly, Veronica Douglas asks, what policy is WHO putting in place for equitable access and distribution to COVID pills or treatments? WHO has been so vocal about the importance of people having access to vaccines. You can look up #vaccine equity, and that's something WHO talks about all the time, how the pandemic will not end until the most vulnerable people and people everywhere in the world have had access to vaccines. But should we be talking more also about therapeutics equity and how important it is for people to have access to treatments? That's what both these questions were about. So over to you, Dr. Simao.
Thank you. Thank you for these questions. They are very good questions, actually, because what does it matter if you have a good drug that's coming up and it's not available to people? So it doesn't help, right? So it doesn't help. I think, one of the things that the question about the distribution of medicines, diagnostics, and also I would include in my response also the personal protective equipment. WHO has procured for lower and middle income countries. The question was, what's WHO? Hundreds of millions of PPEs, the personal protective equipment, of dexamethasone. We are working right now with a plan, right now for this past year actually, on a plan for the fixing the provision of oxygen, for example, and for the other medicines that are needed for low and middle income countries where they wouldn't have access otherwise. So WHO does procure these medicines and these products and deliver to countries. Now, on the issue of equitable access, because many people will know that we work on an allocation of access of vaccines to low and middle income countries and to countries in general through the COVAX facility. For the therapeutics, as they become available, we are working on considering, especially these products where we know that they won't be available on the needed quantities at least for the first 6 months after they have been recommended by WHO. We are also working on an allocation framework, an allocation mechanism that would take into account, for example, the severity of the pandemic in the country, the outbreak in the country, how is it moving, a country with a lot of patients, because these are the patients who will benefit from therapeutics, right? Vaccines, they benefit everyone, especially the groups at high risk. Therapeutics, they have to follow the thread of the infection. Where you have more patients, you should have more therapeutics available. I'd like to add something to what Janet was saying in your previous question, Nika. When you're talking about therapeutics treatment, right? On one side, we have those medicines that are injectable, right? So they are used in certain settings, like hospitals or clinics and so on. So the patient doesn't self-medicate, right? The risk when you have pills, like tablets that will become available right now and will become more commercially available as well, that people think they can be used for everyone. And what Janet was saying, it's very important to be paid attention to, because they are only useful for specific types of patients. Right? So the banalization of treatment has to come in the context of other measures we can talk about it later. But it's super important that that self-medication doesn't happen when these tablets come into the market. I'll stop here.
That's building exactly on what Dr. Diaz said, that it needs to be the right treatment for the right person at the right time. Because, as we said a lot when we saw such positive news about corticosteroids, if taken at the wrong time, they can actually make you much more sick, and that's really dangerous. So you need health workers in the whole health system to help you make that decision and make sure you're not harming yourself when you think you're healing yourself, or worse almost if you were administering medicines to a loved one and you think you're helping them by giving them something that actually has no effect or may make them sicker. So that's why it's so important for people to have access to the right kind of advice. I'm just going to have one more question for you, Dr. Diaz. A lot of people were very excited about the idea of being able to take a pill, thinking that this means they don't have to be injected with a vaccine. Why are these new antivirals not a replacement for vaccines?
I think that's a great question. And we have to be very clear that these new oral antivirals, these treatments are not replacements for vaccine. The best intervention for COVID-19 is to prevent it from happening from the beginning. And all we can do to do that is the most important thing. And the vaccines are very well proven to reduce severity, severe disease, and death. And so I think as a prevention, this is the number one intervention that we need to do. We know that people can still develop COVID-19 after infection. So it's not, it doesn't reduce your complete risk of ever getting the infection, but it does reduce death and it reduces severe disease. So these oral antivirals are not a replacement for that.
And we've also, WHO has also spent a lot of energy explaining that vaccines also don't solve the problem by themselves. So we always say it's not vaccines or, it's vaccines and. Even if you've been vaccinated, it's important, if COVID is still spreading in your community during that time when there is still transmission, because you can still catch the disease and you can still spread it, it's important to keep your distance from other people, avoid crowds like we're doing today. We're doing this remotely from each other. We're together in our hearts, but physically remote from each other. It's important to ensure you have good ventilation, open a window if it's safe. It's important to wash your hands still, and it's important to wear a mask when you're with other people, when you're in crowds. So it's vaccines and. So let's wrap up. I just wanted to quickly talk about a few of the countries where people are watching us from, and I won't say all your countries, but I'll give it a shot. So India, Niger, UK, USA, Canada, Ghana, Peru, Colombia, Kuwait, Sierra Leone, Libya, Argentina, Pakistan, Turkey, Rwanda, Mozambique, Yemen, Somalia, Tanzania, Mexico, Ethiopia, Qatar, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, Iran, Cameroon, South Sudan. So thank you very much for joining us today. If you missed the beginning, you can rewatch this. This will be on it'll be on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, so you have a chance to watch this again as well. Do you have any parting words for us, Dr. Diaz? We heard from you a lot. Maybe just give Dr. Simao the chance to give us the parting words today. Any advice for people during these still difficult times?
Let me say that we see light at the end of the tunnel, but it's not over yet. So we need to use everything that's available right now. We need the vaccines, and we need all countries to have access to vaccines. We need all people that are high risk of developing severe disease or dying receiving vaccines first. That's one thing. We need the public health and social measures that you just mentioned, Nika, and these are super important because people, once they have the vaccine, they feel like they are protected. And now with the announcement that there will be pills to treat, people will feel even more safe. And actually, it's not over yet. We need a combination. We need to be able to treat people when they are sick, and we need to be able to prevent that they contract severe disease by using the vaccination. And we need to make sure that the public health and social measures are in place. And I think we are seeing the countries that have relaxed too much are now facing resurgence of cases. So we're going to end the acute phase of this pandemic, but it's not over yet.
That's probably not what people really want to hear, right? We will be so, so happy when we're able to say that this pandemic has ended around the world. But thank you both for the work you do in trying to get us to that point. Thank you to everyone who's watching and all the efforts you make day in and day out, whether you're a healthcare worker, a frontline worker of another sort, or just a person who's staying home to make sure that you don't potentially make someone else sick, or if you're someone who's helping somebody else stay home by bringing them their groceries or whatever it is you're doing to help make this pandemic end. Thank you very much. So just to wrap up one more time, my name is Nika Alexandra. I'm part of the communications team here at the World Health Organization in Geneva. We just heard from Dr. Mariangela Simao. She's our Assistant Director General for Access to Medicines and Health Products. And we also heard from Dr. Janet Diaz, who's the lead for clinical management in WHO's Emergencies Program. Thank you both very much. And thank you to everyone at home. Bye-bye. See you next time.